Welcome everyone to this Church Urban Fund webinar. If we haven't met before, my name is Amy. I'd like to welcome you all here this morning and thank you very much for coming. This webinar is called Resilience for Leaders and Volunteers of Church-Based Social Action Projects. And we're just very happy to have you with us here this morning. So before we begin, just a little bit of housekeeping for us. This session is being recorded, but your faces won't be visible in the recording. So no need to worry about that. We will be sending the recording to you afterwards, and we'll also pop it on our website so you can direct others to it afterwards who aren't able to be here this morning. You should be able to see a Q&A button at the bottom of the screen, perhaps, maybe at the top, depending on what device you're on. And we'll be using that as we go through for you to put your questions in as we go along. Excuse me, I'm coming down with an autumnal cold. So if you can't find it, do feel free to just use the chat. That's fine. I'll pick up your questions, but there'll be a time towards the end of the session where we'll go through and answer any questions that you have. Remember, no question is the silly question. Ask away, please. Now, we will be talking about mental health. We'll be talking about burnout, stress, other sensitive related topics this morning. This is designed to be a really safe space to explore those issues, but do ensure you're taking care of yourself. If something is affecting you, please do feel free to leave the webinar and make sure you're speaking to someone if you need to do that. So thank you for joining us. We hope this will be really helpful for you, encouraging or empowering to you in some way this morning. So this webinar is the third in a series of 5 webinars that we're running for churches. They're all designed to equip and inspire you as you engage with your communities and do the incredible work that you're doing. Each of the webinars links to one of the Growing Good themes, which is our free 6-session course, helping churches to explore the connections between social action, discipleship and growth. So today we're linking to the theme of perseverance, which is one of the 5 explored in the course. And we'll hear a little bit more about the Growing Good course at the end of our session today from Polly. But for now, for today's session, it's time to introduce you to Corin Pilling, who you may know. So Corin is a great friend of CUF and the Together Network. He is the UK Director of Sanctuary Mental Health Ministries, and he's going to be leading our session this morning, for which we are very grateful. Thank you very much, Corin. I'll hand over to you now.
Thank you, Amy. It's a pleasure to be with you all, even with this seasonal transitional cold. I don't know if anyone else has got one of those, but yeah, there are a few hands up there. It's one of the things that I suppose it reminds me of is that you know, our well-being, it's never in a fixed state, is it? And so opportunities like this are a really good chance for us to assess where we are presently and start to look at, is there anything that might need to shift in order for us to do the ministry and the work that we're involved in sustainably. So I hope that the time that we have will offer you a chance to reflect on your current context. And as part of that, there are going to be some opportunities to share. Now, given the volume of people that are here, I'm going to ask you to do that using the chat. But having said that, it will be important to get your input into this. I think what I've found is it just will make it richer than me doing just a presentation on this. Partly because I think wellbeing is deeply contextual. And within the settings that you're in, there will be particular issues and common issues that come up that will be helpful, I think, for everybody to hear you speaking to too. So I hope there'll be a chance for that in the time that we've got. Now, a brief word on Sanctuary. Sanctuary Mental Health Ministries started in the UK in the pandemic. And it wasn't my plan to do that, but this is how things worked. And so as part of this, as part of our work in equipping the church to be more aware and responsive to mental health challenges within our community, I realised that one area that we needed to look at was the needs of people in leadership and in service on the front line during this very stretched time. So a strand of our work from the beginning has been thinking about how do we equip those who are under increasing pressure in these contexts. So some of the things that we'll be looking at today are touching on those things. And I think for me, an ongoing journey of learning around this, and some of that's personal. We've all had our own pandemic journeys. We'll touch on that in a little bit. But also some of it's also drawn from my experience of being involved in frontline work for 20 years, particularly working with homeless people, running projects, and in a sense, sort of being in that space of being often in highly reactive environments where there can be, crises to be managed, but also longer term and chronic issues. So there's definitely, I've sort of got skin in the game really in this. Also recognizing that increasingly within our context, there are pressures that are coming that are new or increased. So really it's coming from a standpoint of saying, let's take a moment to pause and look at this together, share some of our collective wisdom on it. And I hope also there may be some new thinking for you that might kind of stimulate perhaps a different approach to things. So that's the hope. We're going to do it in 2 sections. Now, the first section we'll be looking at will be exploring essentially some of the issues around the impact of stress within our context, and thinking specifically about burnout and its impact. And then when we've done that, we'll be looking to spend some time in spiritual reflection for the second part, before we then go and look at specifically what's happening for us personally, and looking at some tools that might help and maybe clarify any priorities that we start to identify and ways forward. So that's how it's going to run. And I'm excited for an opportunity to talk to you all. So thanks for being here and being part of it, and I'll be looking forward to hearing from you. So without further ado, I'm going to just share a slide. What I'd like to do is encourage you in the chat to share something with me. So it's this. I'd like to know from you what helps. What are your non-negotiables when it comes to your well-being? What would you say are the things that, actually these things need to be a regular part of my life in order for me to sustain my well-being in my context? So I'd love to have a look in the chat. Let's take a moment just to say, enough sleep. Oh my goodness, some of us struggle with that, but it's very important that it's prioritized. Having a day off every week. Thank you. Exercise, time alone as an introvert, getting out of doors, time to potter around. I really relate to that. I find it so therapeutic, and I'm a little bit off unless I have that time. Consistent day off with no phone. Time with God, peaceful time, walking the dog, morning devotional, communicating with colleagues. I think that's probably very important for those of us who are working remotely a lot. The need for that connection is important. Minimum 7 hours sleep, daily time with God, prayer routine, sleep, Sabbath rest. Gratitude. Yes, something that has been proven to boost well-being in different tests, whether that's done in a way that's thankfulness to God or other practices. Daily exercise, even just dancing around my kitchen. I would really recommend that, whether you're doing it by yourself or with others. Definitely something that helps us to kind of connect to our sense of energy and life that we have. Prayer partner, accountability. Sometimes those rhythms only happen with others, don't they? The things that give us life. And so that can be very important as a foundation to what we do. Someone else is really agreeing with that. There's a really interesting spread of things here that have come up. Just looking through that list, see if there's anything else I've missed there. What's very interesting, of course, is that we're getting a sort of a balanced picture. Time with the arts and intellectual pursuits, for example, recitals, exhibitions, lectures, and study. Sort of a pattern, I suppose, of things that are either restful or energizing. Consistent day off and introvert time. There's something about the rhythms that are important, and there's a lot here that really indicate that many of us are in those rhythms that are restorative in terms of physically restful. Outside with God's creation. I don't know about you, but my anxiety just tends to reduce greatly when I'm in open spaces. And thankfully for the flat I live in, I'm in the middle of London in King's Cross. I've got a whole kind of canopy of trees, which is a rare gift in the city. But for many of us, just need to get out into the country, and some of us it's on our doorstep, so we have that benefit. One-to-one deeper conversation, not just chit-chat. So the need to connect is really important. Again, in busy days, it can often be hard to get that. So being intentional around it is often important for many of us. Very, very important stuff. Interesting. I hope that as you look at that, you think those are things that really relate to me in terms of the non-negotiables. Great principles at play here. And what I'd like to do is sort of just get you to think at the moment, and we won't answer this in the chat. How often do you actually do those things? And does it feel like enough? How often do you do those things, and does it feel like enough? I think that's a key question to consider as we look at this topic. And one of the things I've noticed is that it can be quite hard when our routines change to keep the equilibrium. And so if you've been through something like that lately, this session could be an opportunity just to reassess where you are. So I think there's something we've seen here in terms of what you might call rhythms of restoration and rhythms that give life. And sometimes it's also about spontaneity and enough spontaneous moments that can be helpful. And we'll all need different amounts of that, of course. And that might change due to the context that we're in and the shifting times that we're in. And these contexts can be really important, I think. And one of the big challenges, I would say, of the pandemic is the disruption that it brought to normal rhythms. And so I'm just going to share a slide that will start to help unpack that a little bit more, if I can. So this is a little picture of something that has been named as an experience that many of us have been through within the pandemic. And it's this concept of collective trauma. Now, what's helpful to remember about an idea of collective trauma, that this idea that we've been through multiple losses together, is that the picture of being in the ripples of an earthquake can be most helpful. So some of us may have been at the epicenter of that, first responding, as it were. Others of us have been in the fallout of it. So it's recognizing that, again, within an event such as a pandemic, we're all caught up in it to a degree or another. Now, we may not describe our experience as that of being traumatized. However, we may be around people that have been, and so hence being in the ripples. And so one thing I would say that I hope we can all agree on is that we've emerged from this pandemic into a really complex environment, economically and also existentially. We've emerged into a context of war and its impact on our doorstep and in our communities and our response. Greater concern existentially around the climate crisis, massive economic pressures. All of these things are part and parcel. And I think it's really important to acknowledge these in terms of the context of the communities that we're in. And also, I mean, just something that sort of, as it were, a breaking report. I don't know if anybody saw the report from Theos on the decline in the numbers of volunteers. So we're in a situation that we're probably all impacted by in this context, that those of us who are involved in supporting and working with, and may even be volunteers ourselves, seeing often those pressures increasing in those contexts. So, you know, on the one hand, that means if there isn't more people and more energy, we have to renegotiate our commitments and how we manage those things. And something I'd just quickly say on this is that I think I've noticed that within our society, we can often look at burnout as something that is almost indicative of personal failure. And that's really problematic in terms of, I think, I guess what you might see as a kind of particular capitalist reading of our lack of productivity. Instead, you know, something that's developed within a culture or situationally within a pandemic is a really important way to look at it. Something that's actually a really understandable response to a very difficult context. Yet, of course, despite the fact that there may be systems and pressures that are well out of our control that have caused it, a good amount of personal reassessment is really important when we start to see that there may be signs of it. which I have found personally and also observed in others, it's often incredibly hard to do when you're in that space. So today, even, we're taking some time to carefully explore what might be our first tasks if we're showing signs of exhaustion. But also the context that you're in and where the rubber really hits the road. And this is another one for the chat, and I'd love to hear from you on this. What are the key factors that impact well-being, you would say, for those on the front line? I'd love to hear from you. When you look at your colleagues, maybe look at yourself or the context that you're in, what would you say are the things that are particularly impacting? This is interesting. To feel valued, that's a really important thing. Previous to the previous conversation, too many people with significant needs that you can't meet. Good supervision discussion after an incident is something that really helps. Expectations on time, our secular mindset, so people perhaps not understanding kind of the motivations, that might be one of the elements. Lack of appreciation from hierarchy has a negative impact. Low resources, overwhelmed by issues brought to us by clients. Where do we begin? We do that, but that's not the only problem. It's just the top layer. Lack of communication. So this is often a thing that comes up, isn't it? And the way that that can sometimes leave us feel a bit alienated, or again can lead to misunderstanding and conflict. If you suggest something that might be done differently, they react badly and get out of proportion, upset, take everything as criticism. I guess people might be thinking, you know, that could be people that we're trying to support, or it could be our superiors. That either of those things could be likely. Availability of support and guidance, competent trustees. So that sounds quite specific to a situation of, you know, you're in a situation where things are changing quickly, funding is under pressure. How do we respond within the capacity that we have? Doing more with less time and resources. How do we do that sustainably? Is that even possible? And how we maintain healthy boundaries, not getting too involved. And again, perhaps those situations you found yourself in where you've responded to a crisis, and then the expectation perhaps on the individual has continued beyond that, and there's been a need. And then how would you manage that in a way of sort of drawing in a new boundary around it? It can be very difficult. And expectations, perhaps even of your superiors, of just stretching to do more. A cultural feed of bad news, of hyped drama. I think that's a great observation in terms of the sort of the climate that we are talking about, you know, of how do we manage that well? You know, how do we step into places of modeling hope within the reality that there are some real difficulties here? You know, how do we adopt something that feels like it holds what I would call both lament and the reality of the difficulties that we're facing, and hope that is needed and is at the core of the gospel. Some really interesting things. There were a lot of things that came through here that I've missed, I've realised. But there's some, it's very, very, very interesting, the kind of low resources issue, and perhaps that sort of give an expectation that despite the fact the resources have even become, the demand has increased and the resources may have reduced, that you will be expected to deliver the same thing. And perhaps we have that expectation ourselves at times. So how do we open up those conversations within our teams that can start to help us look at that? Now, one thing I want to do is just look at this topic of how we talk about burnout and how we understand stress, first of all. So stress, in a very simple definition, it can be defined as any change that causes physical, emotional, psychological strain. And stress is just your body's response to anything that needs attention or needs action. And some of that can be good. And as we see in the slide here we're in a place of good stress, the optimal stress. I don't know if any of you currently experience that. It's a lovely feeling of productivity and focus. But equally, there's a recognition that might not always last forever if stresses increase. And again, that issue of greater demands, fewer resources. And I think one of the things I've noticed that we're not often well equipped to recognize stress showing up in our bodies. And so our body's natural response to stress needs a physical completion. And there are daily rhythms that will help us release cortisol, which is the stress hormone. But without enough of these rhythms that will help us release cortisol, we find ourselves often driven by it. And so in those times of being highly driven by cortisol, we can stop seeing that we need to take action. And I don't know about you, but I've definitely found an addictive quality to that in the times where I was in my most reactive jobs. And often there's a negative impact when you stop. So something about recognizing and naming and understanding a little bit about stress. But stress is cousin, burnout. Well, what does that look like? Well, obviously the accumulation of these things can result in this, but it's a state of emotional, physical, mental exhaustion, which will be caused by a prolonged period of those stresses. And this is what that looks like. So you'll find often an increased sense of activities feeling stressful and frustrating. We might develop a level of emotional exhaustion. Problems with our performance will arise. So we find that we're just taking longer to do things often, that the level of focus that we have isn't there. And you might also find, if there is this set of symptoms, that there might be other accompanying signs that show that you're not coping terribly well. So, for example, these might be escalating sort of incidences of self-soothing behavior. Things that might feel dissociative. So it could be endless scrolling. It could be, for example, reaching for alcohol more regularly, perhaps shopping, maybe escapism that comes with a level of shame. For some people, that might be using porn, or retreating perhaps to older patterns that you thought you'd left behind. So, the sort of patterns, I suppose, that arise when there's a sense of us not being at home with ourselves. And another thing that will be part of it may be around sort of negative thinking and cynicism that might accompany it. And so often with this, you might flag symptoms of compassion fatigue. And these might be signs that are sort of early signs that you're on the road to burnout. And now this can be subtle. Now, often within homelessness, I would say that sort of gallows humor featured really big within our context. As a sort of survival response to working often with people who were often experiencing high levels of trauma, and we ourselves working with secondary trauma in that context. And many of you may be in that position as well. So there's a real difference, I think, between that idea of sort of those coping mechanisms and actually that sense of an ongoing period of hopelessness and cynicism and a lack of ability to care and a loss of interest. And this, I think, can be quite a big taboo, I think, particularly in faith-based settings, because, it cuts so closely to the reason why we do it. And actually, we can often feel a level of guilt and shame, when in reality, it is just a symptom of exhaustion. It's just a symptom of exhaustion. So we might attach a value to that perhaps is unhelpful. But actually, I think probably if there's an ongoing sense of an experience of compassion fatigue, that it's time to take some steps of self-care in that setting. So just a bit more information on this before we unpack further. One of the things that's felt quite helpful is looking at what are some indicators that something may not be right. So we've looked at a few of those there, but this is a helpful, I think, little rating system. So just take a look at that slide. So we'll just work that through. So to begin with, when we're in a good place, when we're thriving, we can see what that looks like: calm and steady, minor mood fluctuations. We're taking things in our stride. Feels like generally we're getting the job done as we'd like to. And we can make changes relatively easily, and we can focus. I guess a lot of you are looking at that list and saying, oh, I dream of this. I remember the time when I could experience that. It's been a long time. And then this other second column, surviving. So this idea of, I'm not doing as well as I'd like to. So there may be these increased mood fluctuations that we talked about that comes with it. And it may be, we find that our work happens more in fits and starts, and that we feel that we could be easily overwhelmed. Irritation increases. We find ourselves perhaps in that situation where we're surprised at how angry we are at a colleague, or maybe frustrated at ourselves. And another thing for some of us that can accompany this is that suddenly we start to really micro focus on things that we feel we can control. And when change comes our way, it feels like, another thing that I'm being asked to do is too much. The sleep, again, we may find ourselves struggling with a period of insomnia, or early waking, chronic insomnia over a long period of time. Eating might fluctuation, it becomes a bit less healthy, or it may be we may find our appetite changes. We want to eat more or less. We craving for sugar perhaps. And I think this is another key. Things that we used to enjoy start to become almost neutral. So the reason I've circled this is because I think this is often the time where we can start to think about actions rather than in the struggling space. Now, these two other columns, I can't keep this up. So this is when these symptoms increase. And I think a really key sign is that decisions become really, really difficult, and concentration is something that's hard for us to achieve. We might find ourselves withdrawing rather than checking in. It feels almost too exhausting to be in contact with people. And again, that will vary depending on our, where we're at on the introversion and extroversion scale. There might be some physical symptoms as well that come, and increased issues around sleep, etc. I've talked a bit about self-medicating or self-soothing, I named it. Again, that might be becoming more problematic, and you might find yourself more reliant on that in order to kind of be okay. And again, that can be something that you might self-judge on. But again, it's a response to a situation. And then in the crisis situation where there may be even more extreme things, and I won't run through that list, but you will see that there's quite a lot there that kind of is an indicator that, things have gone a long way down the line, and that actually, you've reached a situation that is really unsustainable. So I'm interested now, as we look at that, to hear from you. If we look at the area of surviving, what you'll see, I've circled that, where I put something isn't right. I'd like to hear from you. What would you say are the things that stop people acting in these moments? Why do we generally not take action when we're seeing signs like this? I think it's just really worth naming. What are the reasons why people tend not to take action in these moments? Just take a moment to hear from you. Because you feel, I just need to work a bit hard to fix it. This is such a great summary of the problem of being in that high stress level and can't stop. You can't drop any responsibilities. British pride, I can't seem to have issues. Yes, exactly. We can have a culture of we just cope. And that can happen a lot in ministry as well. I hear something I hear a lot is, but it's just a job. And so that stops the conversation often around sustainability. Also, it's just a moment. That's great. You might think, well, this is overwhelming, but I'm okay. And perhaps that might stop us seeing the pattern. And again, it's around how often and regularly these things turn up, because we might find ourselves bouncing in survival, but then there's enough within our rest cycles and within the way that we restore ourselves that can happen. Maybe we don't feel we have the time to stop and reflect. That's a really brilliant thing to say. I think, we're relying on ourselves too much. It just feels that we can't build that into the routine. It's hard to do it. It feels costly. It means that if we're doing that, then there's something that's not being done that feels mission critical. Needing to be strong for the team. Yeah, that's huge. We're working with a group of people who are often really pushed. How do we hold it together? People are looking to us for that. How does that work? This is good. You say to yourself, it'll be better after Christmas, end of year, after the festival, when they leave, when you get a new volunteer. How familiar is that to people? Yeah, it's all self-talk that kind of keeps us from saying it. It's all about survival and all good for temporary spaces, as in, if that was a temporary space, there's nothing wrong in saying that. But unfortunately, the problem with it is that when that becomes the norm, what happens, of course, is that we haven't been able to adjust our response and routine in a way that's been helpful. Fear, loss of credibility. My word, often we're in positions where there are tremendous expectations that are placed on our shoulders. Sometimes those are perceived, sometimes they're to do with also what is being conveyed to us. And particularly within those in kind of a very prominent leadership role, I'm thinking of you in ministry, the particular pressure to have it all together and not share vulnerability in I think the name of just keeping everything on the road is really important. And also for some people, let's be honest, that they're not safe environments always to be able to share that level of vulnerability. But of course, if we don't have spaces where that vulnerability is shared, safe spaces, that might not be the context of ministry, then that becomes problematic because there aren't those rooms in which we can actually, we can really share what's going on and have space to connect with ourselves, with others, and make those changes. You don't realize that you're at that point until you talk to someone, yes, who you're vulnerable with. So that sort of the need to know that there is that individual that you can have that conversation with. People are so busy. Everything seems to be our priority. You look at the list of things, it's like, well, what of these things do I drop? And if I don't do this, it won't get done. Yeah, I think that's probably one of the things that I hear the most. And seeing 3 likes on that is absolutely correct. It's sort of, well, can this really be manageable if this stops and I take the time that I need to readjust my routine? What will happen? Our structures of support are not there or adequate, so it's really hard to have capacity build these in when you need them most. Yeah, exactly. This stuff really needs time, and the demands of the immediate stop that from happening. And that's often why it's the only time that things change for people is when they actually reach the orange or the red. And often it doesn't feel serious enough, such is the shame. But I hope what I'm saying now, I hope you're getting this, that the yellow is serious enough, because what tends to happen is it becomes more costly to pull it back. And again, this is individual. Some people have a level of elasticity. Most of us don't. I don't. Having experienced compassion fatigue and sort of being on the cusp of burnout within roles, it took me quite a long time to bring it back. So my personal experience, and again, my counsel is thinking of ways in which you can act in the yellow zone before you get into the orange. But I also recognize, and again, we're just naming why it's really hard. It's very important that we've got these things that are sort of out there. But also, I hope, maybe it's not much of encouragement, but there's commonality in the things that are coming through here. So I hope that you can get some solidarity from that at the very least, that we are in quite a tricky and complex context in terms of how we start to look at how we deal with this. I think maybe another thing is that within faith spaces, I think there is probably just perhaps a sense in which we will just keep going and that we will somehow be given what we need to do it. But the reality, of course, is that we're finite human beings. We are not God. We are not. Such a trite thing to say in many ways, but sometimes we can be expected to act like we are. Talking further into this issue of burnout, what I've found in some of the research I've done is that there are probably the reasons why people burn out. They're often, there's a whole piece, but there'll be often 3 things that will be the key factor in your burnout. So let's just have a look at that slide now. Somewhere, here we are. So often, to unpack this, there'll be a high volume of tasks that you're dealing with which will be also combined with minimal stress relief and relaxation and restorative rhythms. So just that, in a way, this is the obvious one. You burn out because there's too much to do. There's not enough to energize you or rest you. So that will be the key factor, obvious one in a sense. The other thing that might be more subtle and might be harder to name as a leader is that you're disillusioned. You've not had the resources you expected. You've not seen the results that you've hoped for. There've been a number of difficulties. You perhaps come face to face with your own limitations. And that might be the thing that is the key factor in your burnout. And then the other one is this, and that's that too many of your tasks and responsibilities don't fit your gift. When you took this thing on, there was a reasonable fit. As the job's changed and grown, perhaps people have left and you've had to fill in the gaps. You found yourself doing more and more tasks that really stretch you and are difficult and mean that you're working way more hours because it's not really fitting what you can do well. So as you look at that list, just take a moment to reflect for a minute. In your current situation, and again, just keeping this to yourself, is it one of those that feels more present than another? It might be you look at it and think, hang on, all of those are there. But more likely than not, there may be one thing to look at. And if anyone is in this space of having looked at that sort of previous visual and thinking I'm more in the orange or red zone, my counsel would be to just weigh this, but it might be that one of these things becomes the thing to tackle first, rather than trying to do everything at once. When we're very exhausted, as many of us have discovered, you just can't do everything. So there probably is going to be one thing that will be the key thing that you can start to take some action on. So this is probably not a surprise to you, the next part. But there's quite a lot of there's a big body of research that points to, looks at, I guess, who are the people who are likely to burn out more. And of course, it's the dedicated and committed people. We are the ones who are most likely to burn out. So the ones who work too much, too long, and too intensely. And this can happen, of course, for a number of reasons. We might not want to let people down. We're often continually thinking about how we might make a difference. And often there may be something that we've not named in the chat already. There might be a deeply vocational element to what we're doing that actually, the business of offering a lot of ourselves can be a really joyful and a God-given thing too. And that can create a deep sense of meaning and purpose and connection. But of course, there's a thin line in this. And, that's when we continue to give in ways that will completely exhaust or might deplete us. And so, we can often end up feeling in those times that we've got nothing left to give to ourselves. So just to sort of, and indeed other people, there's nothing left in that. So just to kind of illustrate this a little bit further, we're going to sort of take a little pause in a moment before we go into the second part of the content. Another element that in the studies I've shown about those in ministry and people who are prone to burnout, there's a sort of a study that's looked at particular traits of people in this situation. So it's this. Let's have a look here. And this, I think, can also be, there's commonality in terms of people who are in frontline service, and I think in service-oriented roles that are deeply vocational. And so it's this, it's people who burn out tend to have a particular desire to please others. There might be a particular guilt or shame proneness. We might struggle to be self-compassionate in a way, particularly when things are difficult or go wrong, that we might think no one else is struggling with this. This is just me. This is an indicator that I'm not really up to this. Rather than actually thinking, well, hang on, everyone goes through challenges. This is normal, a normal response to a really difficult situation. And another thing that can be quite tricky as we understand vocation in ministry, and that's around this idea of lack of a sense of differentiation of ourselves from role. So you might want to take a look at that list. And again, for some, it might be kind of, this feels a bit late to know. But there's something, I think, there's a question I've often offered to people in ministry. When we think of vocation and service, my question to those in ministry is, what does a priest look like at rest? You know, because if we're in that space of a sense of living within our calling, then that, I think, necessarily has to be part of how we understand our calling too. So again, it's just in a way, it's just a nod to something that's a way more complex topic, I recognise, than we have time to unpack here. But I'm just popping that up there because I think I sort of call it a little bit of a canary down the mine moment, as in, if that's your particular package of traits, then there will be more work required of you than other people in order to guard against burnout. And I would say that many of us in a position where we might be supervising or managing others, and you may have staff that are also in this zone, and perhaps there needs to be more proactive help around support to people in that position too. So something for ourselves and perhaps something for others as well, as we think about, some of the risks for those of us who are drawn. And of course, there are incredible gifts for people who have this set of traits. It means that often we're incredibly empathetic to others, that we're often very available to others. But also that does need a rebalancing to get to a point of being self-sustaining. One quick thing before we move on to our sort of more self-reflection time, and that's that it is often quite hard to address burnout at the moment, because I think many of us think, well, everyone's going through a tough time, everyone's going through it, and so we may be prone to minimize the impacts of our stress as a result of that. So that might mean that we don't take action that we ordinarily would have before. We just think, well, everyone's going through it. It's really hard. I've got to stretch further. Just going to take a pause just for a minute. I recognise sort of time's marching on, and we're just going to start to think a bit more about our well-being. And I just want to invite you to spend a bit of a time looking at this image. When we think of a biblical picture of well-being, perhaps this isn't the first thing that springs to mind. But it struck me as I was preparing our session that perhaps for some of us, the rest that we get is a little bit like these moments of grabbing moments of respite in the midst of the storm. And I wonder for you, as you look at that picture of Jesus asleep on the boat, what's conjured for you? Do you perhaps think rest is something that we hope is not interrupted, but is rarely not? Does it feel at times stolen? I wonder, as you look at that and think of that particular story of, in a sense, what felt like a stolen moment, but was also an example of trust. What are the things that help you enter into the rest that you need? There may be a particular quality to the waves that you're seeing in your world at the moment. We don't know the full dynamics of Jesus' relationship with trust to the Father, but we are given quite a few clues within the Bible about how it might be different to ours in its consistency. And perhaps in this place of trust, there is an invitation of how can I trust in this moment of there being enough? And how can I trust that perhaps if I do take actions that are the rest that I need, that will be enough, that's enough for the situation that I'm in. So let's just take a moment to pause. I'm just going to leave time for a little bit of silence as you work with that image and think about it. And perhaps you could even ask God to speak to you in that as you check in with yourself. And what sort of holy rest do you need in this moment? I'm going to now move on to just share with you one tool, so we've got enough time to check in with each other with some questions, and then there'll be some more time to hear from Polly, who's going to be sharing something with us. And it's just a short tool that I'm going to offer you now that I hope you might take away with yourself. Small thing to look at. But briefly, I'd forgotten actually, this is a really key thing I just want to share with you. The more I've done research on this topic, the more I've found that anchoring within a spiritual discipline is really important to people's well-being. And I know that probably feels obvious to those of you who are in that space. For a long time, I was talking about it as one aspect of many, but the more research I've done into those in ministry who are sustaining, the more it seems that those having that protected space is very important and a real cornerstone. And it's probably really obvious, but I'm just a reminder of that prioritizing and finding a way, and perhaps, I've certainly myself been on a journey of things that used to be helpful haven't anymore, and needing to explore ways that can be useful, that kind of ground me spiritually in my connection with God, have become really important. So perhaps there's an invitation to you on that journey. Just another slide to share. This is the one. So this is a tool just to help you think about your well-being. So it's a well-being bottle, and it's just one way we can imagine our well-being, and how we can handle stress and its impact. So you'll see the arrows on the top, and they're stressors. So this could be, as we've seen, stress, any type of change that causes physical, emotional, psychological strain. And on the bottom, stress relievers. So those are the things that help us rest, re-energize us, help us connect to ourselves and others. And you'll see that there are different size arrows, and particularly because there may be things that are that are particularly big and chronic stressors in your life. So, for example, you might have it may be that you think, actually, my job is the thing that mainly causes me stress. It might be something else. It might be a relationship. It might be your caring responsibilities. And so equally, on the flip side, you might be thinking about, as we talked earlier about those non-negotiables, what need to be the fat arrows, that relieve the stress? What are those things that can help you get a grip on what's really important to you, and really think about your very specific needs, perhaps even in this moment? So what are those things that can be the stress relievers? It's a small picture and a really simple one in a way, but it's just recognizing that, if we are in a place where our stress feels unmanageable, really the two things that need to change will be about the volume of things that cause that stress, or the things that help relieve it. And again, finding a way to realistically look at those things can be the biggest challenge, as we've named. So I had more for you, but we've run out of time apart from questions. So we'll bring it into land now, and I'll just apologies that we didn't quite get through all of it. You'll see there's a little bit of information on completing stress cycles, which is an additional tool which is offered for you when you're in moments of high stress. And what it's about basically is it's ensuring within periods of high stress that you take periods out in the day that complete your stress cycle. So anyway, there'll be information on that, and we can send those to you. But I'm just very mindful of time. So at this point, I think we've probably got Amy, do we have any time for questions? 2-3 minutes for that before we go into the film? Or should we do that?
I don't think we do have any questions, actually, unless anyone wants to put any in now. Someone said something very interesting, though. I don't know if you wanted to comment on it, Corin, about what does the priest look like in their family, or the context of their other relationships and friendships. They've said, we so often fall into seeing this as an individual matter, but with church vocational work, the whole family can be caught up in the work, and the well-being of the whole family is important.
Thank you, Alana, for that comment. Increasingly, I think there's a real need to think of ourselves in systems. And one of the challenges around well-being is that often the work tends to happen to us as individuals. And again, there's often perhaps a default sense that, you know, we are the ones who can fix that. But the reality, of course, is that, you know, that if our family is thriving, that will have a massive impact. And the way that we're able to spend time and draw from that, that will have an enormous impact. If our community is a place that is healthy, then that will have a big impact. And again, another study that I saw recently, forgive me, I can't remember the name of the author, was showing that for those in ministry where the context is where relationships are broken down, it's the well-being impact is massive. And for those of you that have been in that space, you will know, often it can feel like there's a need to try and repair that. What seems to be indicating is the need to actually leave those situations if they reach a point of irreparability. So I've probably said more than the comment hinted at, but there's very much a sense in that our well-being is happening in whether it's a family system or whether it's in a community system. And so recognizing that the impacts of those, both positive, neutral, and negative, are going to be really important in terms of how we consider our well-being.
Thank you, Corin. We've got one other question come through. Might need to be quite a quick answer as we've got that very good. Which is, how can you approach someone who is in the surviving mode if they are in denial?
This is a really good question. I think in terms of, I think it will come down to what is the behaviour and what's the impact. So again, the relationship may be a part of it. If it's someone you're managing, that perhaps you can be more directive around that and saying, well, this is what I'm seeing and this is how I can see it affecting you and others. It's maybe a bit more tricky if that person might be a friend or a partner in terms of how you navigate that. Again, there may be a sort of a gentle way of raising it in the same way that you might not within a performance context. And that might be talking about, this is what I'm seeing, it's changing. One of the things that I think we need to reflect on ourselves is often when the question for me is, when I'm not doing well, what does that look like? And for those that we care for and manage, do they know that question? And I think that could be something that we can open up, maybe even off the back of this webinar for ourselves. When I'm not doing well, what does that look like? If I don't know that, who's the person to ask that of? Is there someone who knows me well who will tell me, when you're not doing well, these are the signs of that? So there's perhaps maybe a need for us to have more ongoing conversations. It doesn't totally fix that problem, but I think it's sort of, how are we building those things in this time? So we've got a level of accountability and support for each other within our friendships, within our ministry, within our context, particularly if the people who are managing are volunteers. How are we opening up these conversations around well-being? So I think there's perhaps a challenge there of how we can start to do that ourselves when we might too be in survival mode. Press the pause, maybe look at this material again and think about how we can draw that in.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you so much, Corin. So, as I mentioned at the start of the session, this webinar actually links to one of the Growing Good themes of perseverance. Growing Good, if you haven't come across it already, is CUF's free 6-session course helping churches to explore this relationship and the connections between social action, discipleship and growth. So I'm going to hand over to Polly now, who's going to quickly tell us a little bit more about it. Over to you, Polly.
Thanks, Amy. Great to be with you, and that was such a helpful session as well. So the Growing Good Toolkit, as Amy said, it's a free 6-session course from Church Urban Fund for churches who want to get to know their community better, to grow new connections within their congregation and within their community, and to make a difference together. And the 6 sessions include reflection on scripture, films that feature case studies from churches, activities and discussion questions. And the course is based on 3 years of research into how churches grow and flourish through their engagement with social action. And it's structured around 5 key characteristics that were identified in the research as shared by those churches that are flourishing through their engagement with social action. And as we've said, I think the one characteristic that relates best to our conversation today is that of perseverance. So the Growing Good research found that relationships, trust, connections and partnerships all thrive when a church or church-based projects are faithfully present over many years. And I know that most of us will have experienced the value of faithful perseverance. And the Growing Good session helps church groups to recognise the value of persevering, to reflect honestly on the challenges of committing time and energy, and perhaps we've kind of touched on that today, and also to celebrate the fruits of persistent engagement. But at CUF, we also hear that persevering is hard. Resources are scarce, volunteers are few and perhaps getting older, and church leaders are stretched and tired. So I would also point you to the Growing Good sessions on hospitality, on adaptability, and on participation, because those are about creating a culture within the church and within the community where everyone is invited and welcomed and included, so that everyone can play a part in what's going on, so that people's gifts and skills are discovered and developed, so that people move from the outside to the centre, and so that more people are sharing the load as we persevere faithfully. And it's also about being encouraged to try new things, about persevering in different ways that are more appropriate for the changing community context or the congregation or the volunteers or the capacity of the leadership. So that's just a very brief sort of taster of what's in the Growing Good toolkit. It's free. You can sign up on the Growing Good website. And if you've used the toolkit or any of the sessions, we would love to hear your feedback. Please tell us how you found the resources and of any impact that it's had within your church and community. And we're just going to watch. Have we got time for the film, Amy, or shall we leave that for today?
Yeah, we can watch it. It's about a minute.
We'll just watch the film. It's a minute long. It's the trailer, and it gives you a sort of sense of what's within the toolkit.
We all want our churches to grow, to be places where people of all backgrounds can belong, contribute and encounter Jesus, no matter where they are on their faith journey. And we all want communities of joy, justice and right relationships where the work of the Holy Spirit is evident. But how do we make that happen?
The Growing Good Toolkit is designed to help churches connect the dots between social action, discipleship and growth. Through flexible, interactive small group sessions, we will explore how our churches can be faithful and fruitful in our local communities. The Growing Good Toolkit is based on 3 years of research by Theos and Church Urban Fund. We've learned from over 60 churches, big and small, urban and rural, in areas of affluence and in low-income communities, and in everything in between.
As we journey through the toolkit, we will hear from Scripture, as well as research and stories from churches all across England. In our small groups, we'll learn from each other and consider what God might be calling us to do together. And we will pray, seeking God's wisdom and blessing.
God is at work transforming people and places. He's inviting us to be part of his story of transformation. Will you join us in Growing Good?
Thanks very much, Polly, for sharing that. We will send you a link to the Growing Good resources and how you can get them when we email around after the session, along with the recording and resources from today. So we are at the end of our time now. Before you dash off, I just wanted to remind you about the rest of the webinars in this series. So we've got 2 left. You can see those are Adapting to Our Community, Church Beyond Walls, which is going to be about how a group of people took Christian spirituality outside of church buildings to engage in a world increasingly uninterested in religion, God and faith. And then we've got one in November, towards the end of November, on recruiting, managing and retaining good volunteers, which we hope will do what it says on the tin. So please do share those with people in your churches if you think it would be useful to them. You can sign up for those here. I'm going to put the link into the chat, and again we'll also email it to you afterwards. If you missed the first 2 and you would like to watch them back, you can also do that. The recordings are available on our website at this past events link.
Amy, could I just say a quick word about the free resources that we have for everyone?
Yes, of course. Thank you.
Briefly, thanks. So Sanctuary, we provide, our goal really is to equip your church communities to respond positively to mental health in its context. And we do that primarily through the Sanctuary course. It's a free 8-week course. It starts by exploring mental health through lived experience, and then it unpacks that with current learning around mental health, but also reflective and theological input through it. So the idea is your community can then be a place where you're more comfortable in talking about these things and have a deeper and richer way of exploring them. So do check us out. It's all free, and if you Google the Sanctuary course, then you'll find that. And in fact, that's available to you as well through a QR code. And if you've got interest in wellbeing and mental health, just click on the website and sign up for the newsletter. You'll get to hear about other opportunities such as these different training things we're doing, and access to the resource. So we'd love to hear from you. And yeah, thanks for the time today. It's been lovely to have the time to connect with you all. So thanks for that, Amy.
Yeah, thank you so much, Corin, for all the insights you've given us today. And we will also send out the link to the Sanctuary course when we send you an email with everything in it later on. So yeah, thank you everyone for coming along this morning. Sorry we did run over by 5 minutes. Yeah, we'll send you everything via email. In the meantime, if you've got any other questions, don't hesitate to get in touch with us at CUF. You can find the email address on our website. Hope you have a lovely rest of your day. Thanks everyone. Bye.